I would like people to understand that asexual people are very diverse. In the real world, where I have talked to a lot of asexual people, it is culturally and racially diverse. We have a really huge range of people with different abilities and disabilities, people from different backgrounds, people who are rich or poor, people who are same sex attracted, people who are trans, people who are gender nonconforming.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are in your journey, I hope this podcast will help you feel less alone. Today's guest is Julie Sondra Decker, author of The Invisible Orientation: An Introduction to Asexuality. This is a topic I knew nothing about before I read Julie's book, but I've since come to appreciate that the idea of asexuality as a sexual orientation actually goes back to the pioneering work of Alfred Kinsey. Back in 1948, Kinsey identified his now famous 6-point scale, where 1 is purely heterosexual and 6 is completely homosexual, with bisexuals in the middle at 3. Without getting into the pros and cons of his research, I just want to mention that he also found people that didn't fit on the scale because they had no interest in either sex. He called them X's, not zeros. The term asexual was chosen later by those who wanted to embrace asexuality as a unique sexual orientation. There are 2 reasons why I wanted to have Julie on Graying Rainbows. First, I feel certain that there will be listeners who discover that this is the identity that fits them best. But I also want everyone else to come away with an appreciation that asexuality is a legitimate queer identity that encompasses a great deal of diversity. Before I share today's interview, I also want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com, and you can subscribe for free in your favorite podcasting app. Of course, in Apple Podcasts, it's now follow rather than subscribe. You can also get show notes automatically via our newsletter. Just use the link in the show notes or text Graying Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. You spell graying with an A, Graying Rainbows, all one word, to 33777. I would love to hear from you. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. We also have a fan page on Facebook, and on Twitter, it's Graying R. So Julie Sondra Decker, it's great to have you on Graying Rainbows today.
Thank you for bringing me on.
So what we usually do on this podcast is just start out by letting you tell us a little bit about yourself and share your story in whatever way feels good to you.
Sure, I can do that. I am Julie Sondra Decker. I am 43 years old, and I identify as asexual and aromantic. I have not always had that language available to me. That was developed in online spaces sometime in the early 2000s-ish. But before that, in the 1990s, when I was growing up, I used the term non-sexual. I have always felt this way, which the definition that I tend to use is a pretty common one in the community, which is that I don't experience sexual attraction. And I also don't experience romantic attraction. But when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, those 2 things did not really seem all that distinct to me. I just knew that I wasn't interested in any of it, and everybody else was. So in those days, of course, you see it in the media, all your friends are talking about it, people are hitting on you, people are starting to think that there's something wrong with you, you don't want to participate in it. To some extent, I did experiment with dating when I was a teenager, but by the time I was a college student, I had already figured out that I wasn't going to find it rewarding if there wasn't some kind of signal from myself that oh, I'm attracted to that person, or oh, I'm inclined to try this. I was really just very armored against other people trying to wear me down into being interested in trying out a relationship, because been there, done that, and didn't find what I was looking for. So basically, a lot of people kind of interpret the idea of asexuality as if it's some kind of vow, or that you're closed minded or you're not interested in trying new experiences. But for me, it was empowering to say, I'm going to use this language until it does not describe me. And it just so happened that nothing did ever change for me so far. It would be pretty strange if in my mid 40s, suddenly I started experiencing sexual attraction to people, but I still am not dead set against it. I haven't decided, I haven't made a decision. I'm just continuing to describe myself the way that the past and the present seem to be telling me the future will be.
So, since this is a podcast that's sort of aimed at people that are identifying as part of the LGBT plus community later in life, what is the relationship in your mind between asexuality and, say, the LGBT plus community?
Well, my opinion and the opinion of many people in the wider LGBT plus community is that asexuality is inherently non-heteronormative. It's considered a queer orientation to a lot of people, and especially people that are in our sort of older age group have experienced queer as sort of a slur, some people just got called that when they did not want it. So I know that some of us embrace that and some of us don't. But I feel that asexuality has always been outside of the realm of expected heteronormative behavior. So even though some people on the inside of the LGBT plus community will look at asexual people and say, I don't understand why you would consider yourself to be part of this, there are also many other people who understand exactly how asexuality is not normative in the sexual arena, that we are still affected, albeit in sometimes different ways, by heteronormativity, and that we have trouble connecting with other people like ourselves if we keep getting seen as like straight light, almost like if you're not gay, then you must be straight. And that is not the case for us. Most of us, even if we don't identify as one of the other stripes of the rainbow, even if some of us who have romantic orientations that have us being same sex attracted or bisexual or pansexual or might be trans or otherwise non cis, we are still going to see that we don't fit in with straight people in some pretty important ways, and that we have, if not overlapping, many times parallel struggles.
So, for those of my listeners who may be new to this term asexuality, what does it mean under the current use of the term in the community? What does it mean to say that one is asexual?
The most popular definition is the one that I used earlier, which is that you don't experience sexual attraction. It's distinct from a behavior, which will be very familiar for those of us who have heard about the difference between, that it's not a choice, it's not a whether you're having sex that defines you as your orientation. But some people who are asexual do like to incorporate their interest in sex into their definition. So less commonly you might hear people who say they don't enjoy sex, or they don't, I guess they don't feel about sex the way that many other people who might be very satisfied by it or may feel that they need it in their lives to be happy. That some asexual people will say that action not being of their lives is a big part of their orientation. And then, of course, there are asexual people who are sexually active or are not sex repulsed. So it is not defined on the behavior, but depending on who you talk to, whether a person engages in sex may also be important to someone's definition. But yeah, the most common definition is the one about whether you experience sexual attraction, which in our case is no.
So, what about what asexuality is not? That's pretty important.
Oh boy. Well, there's a lot of things that it gets misunderstood as. Probably the most common one is that it gets misunderstood as celibacy. That kind of ties in with what I just said about how it's not necessarily about behavior. We don't say that people who are not having sex are therefore asexual. We don't say maybe a heterosexual virgin is asexual until they start having sex. That's not how people think of orientation. So in our case, that's very distinct because it's very common to see us as a not yet. If you are asexual, it's like a blank space or it means you're undecided. But for me, it's not having no sexual orientation, it's having a sexual orientation of no. So it is also not necessarily a religious thing. It can be, obviously, it can be part of an asexual person's life that they may also have a celibacy vow going on or a religious beliefs associated with celibacy, but it is not defined as religious celibacy or as saving yourself. It is not an anti sex position necessarily. It is not a sign of trauma necessarily. It is not a sign of mental illness necessarily or physical illness necessarily. And I keep saying necessarily because, of course, there are people who have experienced these things, either illnesses or trauma, and always going to have some people who have experienced those things in any population, but they are not definitive. And that's the important aspect of it. It is not a statement that we hate any particular gender. It does not mean we're necessarily confused about our gender. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we just can't find anyone to date or had a bad experience with dating or are temporarily not interested in dating. It's pretty much similar to just about everybody else's sexual orientation, that it tends to be consistent. Just like anyone else, we might be fluid or we may change our label over our lifetime. But for the most part, we do tend to identify as asexual as a mature state.
Do we have any idea about how many people are asexual using this orientation definition?
It's really kind of up in the air. It's very hard to decide what that number is because the definition of asexuality can be a little murky. And depending on what definition that you use, if you maybe look back at older studies like Anthony Bogart did, he studied a population that had answered a particular way about not having any attraction to, quote, males or females, I believe was the way that people had answered in a British survey. This is data from a specific place in, I believe, in the 1990s that was later analyzed and come up with about 1% of the population. And that is a number you hear a lot about asexuality, is that there may be about 1% of the population, but that is making a lot of assumptions. It's making the assumption that data is generalizable to other parts of the world and that it is still accurate and that it uses the definition that everybody else is using. And I also think that number may be much larger if you include other stripes of asexual spectrum, like demisexual or gray sexual. And there may also be, depending on the definition, there may be fewer because there may be people who are using that a little bit more liberally and may not fit maybe stricter definitions. So it's just really hard to decide how to come up with a good number. But the one you'll probably hear the most often is the 1% figure.
And that means millions of people.
It does.
Right. So what about unique challenges that people who identify as asexual face?
I think the biggest two that I tend to hear discussed in the community is mental health and relationships. With mental health, sometimes, especially if the person does not already know they're asexual, you may be trying to access mental health services and you have some counselor that won't stop latching onto this idea that all healthy people are sexually interested, that this is always going to be a symptom, and they'll fixate on it. They'll medicate you over it. They'll get it into your head that this is a very serious problem. And I have definitely heard horror stories from other asexual people, many other asexual people who have had both medical doctors and mental health practitioners focus so heavily on wanting to see them be sexual that they compromised other aspects of their health and did not listen to them. And relatedly, in relationships, it can be very difficult to find, I guess, competent relationship counselors. Where if you're an asexual person and you're dating someone who is not asexual, who is confused about why doesn't this person desire me, or why is this person not enthusiastic about sex, or why is the person refusing to have sex? And if you try to access services, many times they will immediately side with the person who desires sex and try to fix the person who does not desire sex and focus on them as this is the person who has the problem rather than these two people have mismatched desires. So it's very common in that. But even outside of maybe counseling, if you're not going to access those services, but you're trying to date people, you're trying to get people who understand you, or people who are not going to gaslight you into thinking that you will desire them sexually if you actually love them, etc. It can be very scary to try to find somebody who will, I guess, meet you on an even ground, because there's so much feeding into this status quo that, of course, if you're in a relationship, you're going to have sex. And there are so many people out there who will feed into this, who will make asexual people in relationships feel that this is absolutely necessary. It's a definitive aspect of romance, whereas we do not experience it that way if we experience romantic attraction but not sexual. So I think those are the two biggest issues that I've heard that are ongoing and very complicated. But there are others. So
One of the things that you wrote that really struck me because it was so well put was you said, a person doesn't challenge someone who says that they're heterosexual and say, you should try having sex with the same sex person. You might like it. Yet, if you say you're asexual, they're going to say, well, if you'll just try sex, either virgin, you just might like it. Basically, having your identity discounted.
oh, yes, absolutely. It's very hard to get across to people how sure a person can be because, and let's face it, I know that this is not necessarily the easiest thing for people of this population to hear, but a lot of times it is cisgender straight men who will say to us, why don't you just have sex? And then we will say, I don't know, why don't you feel that you need to try sex with another man? And they'll be absolutely sure. I mean, assuming that they're not heteroflexible or bisexual or something, I'm talking about straight men, they can be so absolutely certain and they don't feel that any experimentation is necessary, but they just believe that we can be similarly certain if we feel that way about all genders. And they cannot imagine that. I've heard so many times, you have to be attracted to something. Even if they don't say something like that, many times they'll go straight past that to, it doesn't really matter if you're interested. It doesn't matter if you're experiencing attraction or if you enjoy it. You just need to do it because that's your job.
Well, one of the things that I've learned from talking to many people who are discovering that they're homosexual later in life is that discovery doesn't necessarily require actually having sex. They just realize, hey, I'm having these attractions. And one reason why I wanted to have you on the show is because I figure there's probably at least one person out there who's figured out, well, I wasn't really having that with my heterosexual partner. Maybe they died and now you're later in life and you're thinking, well, what happens next? It might be natural to then jump to the, well, I must be gay. So I think it's important. And there's been a lot of people who now identify as asexual who went through that step, right? So that's one reason why I felt like it was really important to have you on the show. So what about crushes? I mean, Could you have a crush and still be asexual? How would you tell the difference? And I guess that gets down to your difference between asexuality and aromantic.
Yeah, just like you can have a sexual attraction, you can have a romantic attraction. And I think a lot of people don't think of them as necessarily distinct because most people have both of those types of attraction to the same kinds of people. But especially us in the LGBTQ plus community, some of us will be experiencing stuff. This is not particularly talked about or normative. So there's probably a lot of people out there who have said, I'm only sexually attracted to this particular gender, but I've had crushes on multiple genders. And I'm not sure what to think of that. Do I just think this same sex person in my life is a very close friend, but somehow I've also had fantasies about having them cuddling in my bed? What does that mean? Does it mean I'm gay? So you might be experiencing a romantic attraction that you don't have accompanying sexual attraction. And for asexual people, I think the majority of us do have some romantic attraction toward either based on a pattern of gender presentation. You may find that you're homo romantic, you may find you're bi romantic or hetero romantic. All of those things are what they sound like they are, but you still might fall in love with that person or have romantic attraction to that person and still just never desire them sexually. So crushes are definitely an experience that non-aromantic people may have. And even aromantic people sometimes have sort of an aromantic version that some of us will call maybe a squish or a queer platonic partnership or something like that. I think in our society, we don't talk about important friendships and non romantic relationships enough. Those can be so powerful and so important, especially for those of us who have had lifelong friendships that may have lasted longer than our romantic relationships. So many of us have a very, very close best friend or couple of friends that we wouldn't dream of giving up for the latest main squeeze or something. These people are so important to us, but it's expected that as soon as we have a romantic partner, that they will be demoted in importance in our lives and that they'll always be, quote, just friends. That rubs me the wrong way because my friendships as an aromantic person are the most important relationships that I have.
So, what kind of resources, when you discovered that you were asexual, what was the main resource that helped you? I know you've written a book, but before you wrote your book, obviously you didn't have your book. So,
Yeah. When I was a kid, there was no internet. So, and I'm sure that plenty of other people out there listening had the same experience where suddenly, when the internet became a thing, there were all these opportunities to maybe meet other people or hear other perspectives that you went from thinking you were the only person on earth who thought this or did this to realizing there's a lot of us out there who think and do whatever it is. As a teenager in the 90s, there really were not resources. That it was mostly just me telling people I'm non-sexual and leave me alone. I'm not going to go to bed with you. And everybody just thought I was weird and there was nothing anyone could do about it. I have always been a writer, so I definitely just reached for journaling to help me work out my thoughts and feelings. And when the internet became a thing, some of those journals became blogs. I don't think we really called them that at the time, but I had a website as early as 1998, a personal website. It just had little rants about personal things that annoyed me. I had a rants page, and among being mad at my roommate and being frustrated about running out of toilet paper, I had a list of things I hate when people say these things to me about being non-sexual. And I had like a top 10 list of the things I hate. And when I posted this online, it was one of my most popular essays where I would get a lot of references from people they'd send me emails or they'd make comments saying, this is relatable, or I have this too, or I've had this experience as well. And I started to realize that there were other people who needed this kind of message. But at the same time that I was doing that, I was not really out there trying to create a resource. I'm less of a community based person. I'm more of a resource creator. And I do love the community, but that's not really my primary way of sharing information or getting or giving in a community. So at the time that I was doing this, there were also some some news groups. Remember those? There were news groups where people were naming asexuality various things. There was like anti-sexualism, and there was a celibacy one, and there were various people having these conversations, but it was loosely organized and fragmented, and some of them developed very sex negative cultures, whereas others became more like what we see in the modern asexual movement. I think until David J. created the Asexual Visibility and Education Network in sometime, I think maybe in 2001, there really wasn't like a central place to access any resources. But from what I've heard, the word asexual and synonyms of it have been popping up in queer spaces since there ever were organizations. Like you'd see it here and there. You'd see in lesbian circles, or you'd see it in pride parades and things like that, even before we had the words.
I guess that people probably aren't surprised to know that women might be asexual, but what about men?
It's interesting that when we have tried to take demographic surveys of our communities, the people who answer that they identify as men is actually lower than the percentage of people who identify as a non-binary identity. And the largest percentage is people who identify as women or as female. Men obviously can be asexual, and I've known a bunch of asexual men. It's very interesting that their experience is typically quite different from that of women or non-binary people. They obviously will encounter people who will tell them that their success as a human being is linked to their sexual success, and they will feel like they have to have sex to be a man. And then of course there's the difference in the level of violence, the way homophobia can manifest toward men, where sometimes all you have to do is not like girls loudly enough, and people will say, oh, you're gay, and I'm going to beat you up because I think you're gay. And that happens less to women. Not that violent homophobia doesn't affect us, but it seems like hypermasculinity is more immediately dangerous sometimes in certain cultures. But it's hard to tell whether there just exist fewer asexual men, or whether it's a combination of, number one, if you have a sex drive and or you like sex or have had sex and didn't mind it, you are more likely to think, well, I guess I'm not asexual then. You may not even relate to some of the narratives that people are sharing about asexuality. If you're a man with a sex drive and you just didn't really mind sex, even if you didn't seem as interested in it as the rest of your peers, you may not really notice that there's anything different about how you're experiencing attraction. So it may be some combination of that, and that for whatever reason, men are less likely to discuss their sexual feelings in places like forums, and may be worried about being labeled because of these perceptions about what men who are not attracted to women must be.
So you touched on another important issue, which is that being asexual does not mean necessarily that a person doesn't have a sex drive, because attraction and sex drive are actually two different things. I want to break in here to thank everyone who is supporting Graying Rainbows via Patreon. If you're interested in helping defer the costs of producing this podcast, just go to patreon.com/graying rainbows. You can pick a monthly pledge that fits your budget. Another way you can support my work is by buying my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. It's available on Amazon and all other ebook sellers. Could you talk a little bit more about the diversity in the community?
Absolutely. Well, specifically on sex drive, I don't know that there have necessarily been any studies, either informal or academic, on the sexual habits, like the sexual experience with partners and without partners that asexual people have compared to the general population. But I have heard anecdotally that asexual people are pretty comparable to non-asexual people as to whether they masturbate. And that is, I mean, it's a highly personal question, I guess. So who knows how accurate our understanding is. But if somebody enjoys having a masturbation experience with toys, with fantasies, with anything, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not an asexual person, because they may still not be attracted to anyone. They may just like that experience. And they may also like sex for similar reasons, even if they're not experiencing attraction to the person. Though it's not necessary to be asexual to not be attracted to someone and still enjoy sex with them. I'm sure plenty of people have said, yeah, well, you're not really that hot, but I'll sleep with you because I just want to sleep with someone. I mean, takes all kinds. As far as sex drive goes, it varies a lot. There are some asexual people who say, I don't have a sex drive at all, or I don't think of myself as having a libido. And then there's other people who are on the opposite extreme. They may enjoy sex with or without partners. They may enjoy using toys. They may be very interested in even some kinds of pornography, although I think it's less common for asexual people to report that anyway. I heard one person say that he thinks of it like scratching an itch or cleaning the pipes. And one guy literally said on his blog, I think about furniture. It's very interesting, but it's difficult, I think, for some people to see that as something an asexual person could want to do, especially if they're talking about sex with a partner. But it really is just, I think it's kind of fixation on what counts as sex. Like, okay, yes, you are using your genitals. That does define it as something sexual in a way, but it doesn't really make sense to say, therefore, you're not asexual because I define asexual this way and that way. Well, we're the ones who should really be defining it, because we're the ones who are using that term to describe an important aspect of our life. So what we're saying it means is what's relevant. So
But let's emphasize again that in its modern use, we're talking about attraction, not behavior.
that's right. Yeah.
I mean, I think that helps a lot. Just like a person who's attracted to people of the same sex might not ever actually act on that attraction.
That's right. And you also don't say that a single person who is heterosexual and is masturbating, you don't say that that person isn't heterosexual because they're not having sex with, a cross-sex partner. It's not, you don't just say, oh, that person's having sex with themselves, so they must be asexual. Like, that's not how it works. It's very strange how people make up different rules for us.
What about intimacy? That's a whole nother thing, right? You could want intimacy.
Oh, sure. And that goes anywhere from maybe physical intimacy to other kinds of intimacy. There's plenty of people out there who have a closest person, and they may be a person that they're married to. They may be a person that they're raising kids with. They may be a person that they've just been roommates with for a really long time and consider a life partner. And they may have access to levels of emotional intimacy that others do not have. I've heard some people say that they define something as romantic based on whether it crosses a certain threshold of the amount of love. But I've also heard people say that it's a type of love. It's not about how much I love a person, is it this particular flavor? So some asexual people will talk about experiencing aesthetic attraction to someone, or that they enjoy having physical intimacy with another person that does not become sexual, but they want to have somebody that they can cuddle with, or that they can have judgment-free massages with, or feel comfortable in the nude with, etc. It's so variable. And I don't know that this necessarily fits into the subject that you were proposing here, but as an aside, there are also asexual people who enjoy kink and might enjoy even BDSM and scenes and things like that, but they are still not gaining the pleasure of that from their attraction to another person. And that's actually common for people who are not asexual, is that they enjoy the experience, not necessarily have an attraction to the person providing it. So there's definitely asexual people who do that.
So, what if a person, I guess it would be a common scenario in an older population, that a person might be in a long term relationship with someone and maybe go, oh, really, that's what's wrong? Or, sorry, I need to say what's wrong because that again buys into the idea that there's something wrong with being asexual. But that's why things haven't been what I thought they should be. Then you have to work it out with your partner, try to tell them the truth and figure out where to go from there. Do you have any words of wisdom for somebody who's facing that challenge?
Oh my goodness. That is one of the most common narratives that I've heard from older populations, because those of us who grew up without the internet, and I guess primarily people who are maybe a little bit older than me too, it's people who are in their 40s and up, I would say, they a lot of times came of age and got into relationships at a time when these resources just didn't exist, and they either maybe were ashamed or confused, or all of their counseling told them, well, you're the problem, you're going to need to like sex, and their partner told them that they're going to need to like sex, or else they're not going to have a relationship. So many of us have just accepted, this is what I have to do. I've never liked it. I've never understood why my partner needs this. I'm just going to do it and accept that it's not for me what it is for them. And this is just my life. And then they discover that asexuality is a thing, and they suddenly feel a mixture of maybe loss and empowerment, that they're newly empowered to say, there's so many people who've been through this, that they're like me. I can refuse to do this. It doesn't mean there's necessarily anything wrong with me. And I don't have to be in this situation. There are alternatives. There's nothing that's inherently wrong with not desiring sex with your partner. Wrapped up in, why didn't I know this earlier? I could have just not wasted so many years of my life in a relationship that was frustrating in this way. Happily, there are many options for people who are in those relationships, but every relationship is so different depending on the mismatched needs. You might have a partner who is like horrified to find that you have not desired them that way, and that their interest in you that way was not reciprocated, and that they've been, quote, making you do this that you didn't want all this time. They may be very sympathetic and say, whatever we have to do, it needs to be on your terms, and I'm completely accepting. But of course, as you would expect, that is not the norm in these relationships. More typically, the typically sexual person is dismayed and feels cheated and feels frustrated and wants to know, well, things were fine before. Why is this changing now? And also, it's not uncommon for some of those of us who are maybe getting into our older years and saying, okay, I'm dealing with maybe a declining sex drive. And even people who are not asexual or on the asexual spectrum may face this, where the mismatch becomes more pronounced, both of the partner's age, and there's all this frustration. So much of the access to resources and counseling are going to focus on, well, how can we make the less sexual person want it more? Let's find some Viagra. Let's find some toys. Let's get you guys into some kind of adventurous club. Let's buy you a copy of a sex position book or something will make it exciting. It's all focused on the best way forward is to make sure that you have sex again. But some people, they discover asexuality and they say, I want this to be over. I don't want to have sex anymore. And it's a deal breaker for me now because I have realized that this is who I am and how I am. I have this knowledge now, and I will not waste my life feeling like I am less than, I'm inadequate and undeserving of a partner who cares about me if I don't give them what they want in the bedroom. But there are a lot of ways that this can be positively resolved. But I should say first that sometimes it is a deal breaker if sex is so important to one partner and it's very important to the other partner that they don't have sex anymore. You may have to decide that you're too mismatched and you'd both be healthier if you go your separate ways. That's one possible way to have a good resolution. But if you do decide to stay together, sometimes there are compromises that the asexual person can say, okay, maybe I don't want to have penetrative sex again, but we could still do this. Will this be enough? Sometimes the non-asexual person will say, okay, well, I can go without sex and just do this and maybe, enjoy some pornography, or maybe we can do these other sex acts that are not crossing any lines for you, and I'll still be happy because I value you more than I value that action. There can be things like toys, there can be things like other opportunities for creative resolutions to your sex drive. As mentioned earlier, there's some things in BDSM or kink if the person is interested in those things, but also the possibility of open relationships. That is something that works very well for certain kinds of people. It can take some of the guilt away and it can take some of the frustration away for feeling like you have this unscratched itch that you no longer feel comfortable offering to your partner. And it takes some delicate negotiation to figure that out if you've never been polyamorous before, but there are definitely polyamorous related solutions that can also help if that's a possibility for the type of relationship these people have.
So the other situation, obviously, is the person who's single and would like to be in a relationship and realizing that whatever the real numbers are, meeting another asexual person is probably going to be unlikely. I guess one challenge would be at what point do you bring up the subject? I've just been thinking about how challenging that would be.
Well, as you can imagine, I've spoken to a lot of people, primarily straight men, who they're just flabbergasted that an asexual woman like me might ever consider getting into a relationship and not bringing it up front, because this is obviously going to be a deal breaker for every single man out there. And he's never going to date you if you're not going to go to bed with him. What? That's ridiculous. How dare you? You're so duplicitous. You must disclose immediately. And, setting aside the fact that many people who end up in these relationships didn't disclose because they didn't have the words and they felt ashamed and they didn't understand why they didn't like sex and they worried that their partner would think that they don't love them. If you do know that you're asexual, it's hard to decide. There's not really a single rule for, hey, this is when I should warn people that I am asexual and may never be sexually attracted to my romantic partner. I'd like to think that most people talk about things that are very important to them relatively early in the relationship, and that is everything from whether they're well matched sexually to things like, well, what are your long-term goals? Do you want to have kids? Do you already have kids? And is that a deal breaker for anybody? What about our pet situation even? Are you okay with living in this house if my mother lives here? Stuff like that. There are so many things that if you want to get serious with a person, you do have to discuss. And ideally, if you know that you have unusual sexual needs, those would be brought up relatively early. But I don't like to think of them as This is something you're going to have to confess, people. It's just should be natural that everybody who wants to be happy in a relationship should be able to talk about these things. And I want to stress that anybody who has relatively typical sexual needs should also get used to having these conversations as well. We should normalize talking about these things and not just take them for granted that, of course, anybody that you're dating is going to have sex with you. I mean, if it's absolutely imperative that the person you're in love with is also sexually compatible with you, you need to bring that up too.
So, Julie, what else would you like to share before we close?
I would like people to understand that asexual people are very diverse. In the real world, where I have talked to a lot of asexual people, it is culturally and racially diverse. We have a really huge range of people with different abilities and disabilities, people from different backgrounds, people who are rich or poor, people who are same sex attracted, people who are trans, people who are gender nonconforming. It's not like all the talking heads that you see on TV every once in a while when it's Asexual Awareness Week and they find somebody who wrote a book. I might be talking about me. And, she's white and she's blonde and she's relatively privileged and she's going to make asexuality very palatable for the mainstream population. And people are going to say, oh, that's acceptable because she's like this. But I don't believe it when somebody is asexual and also depressed or also on medication or also has a history of abuse. There's so much diversity and background in the asexual community that each person's individual story needs to be taken into account when you want to have a conversation with them. And I really would like people who want to understand asexuality to default to listening to us and asking questions that you're not already anticipating that you know the answer to them. Don't ask leading questions like, don't you think it would be better if you would be open-minded enough to try blah, blah, blah. It's like, I think engaging with us will be healthier for everyone if you ask more open-ended, honest questions, if you want to have those conversations with us. There's a lot of us out here, maybe more than you think.
Thanks again for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
I want to thank Julie Sondra Decker for coming on Graying Rainbows to talk about her book, The Invisible Orientation, An Introduction to Asexuality. If you happen to be an Audible subscriber, you can listen to it for free, but it's definitely worth reading if the idea of asexuality is new to you. It should be no surprise that one can discover asexuality later in life, but I do want to emphasize a few key ideas. The first is something I mentioned several times during the interview. Asexual is about attraction, not behavior. A person who identifies as asexual may or may not have sex with members of either sex, and they may or may not masturbate. Being asexual is not the same thing as being celibate, because celibacy is about behavior, not attraction. The second important point is that if someone identifies as asexual, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. They don't need to have their hormones checked or be forced to have sex, because sexual orientation is about attraction, not about behavior. Therefore, each person's description of their identity deserves equal respect. Unfortunately, mainstream media is still promoting the idea that asexuality is a sign of disease, maybe even a brain tumor. But now you know better. I will include additional resources in the show notes at grayingrainbows.com for those of you who want to learn more. As always, you can send me feedback at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next month, I hope you'll check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Graying Rainbows is copyright 2021 to Dr. Virginia Campbell. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.